Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Lyle Goldstein. I'm the Director for Asia Engagement here at Defense Priorities, and we're thrilled to have you here for this very timely discussion. Um, as you all know, President Biden just met with President Xi. That was their first face-to-face meeting since Biden became president, and I think we're all pleased that they have met, and maybe we see some cooling of tensions, including seems like a resumption of um, talks on climate change. That's certainly a good thing. And I noted that President Biden said that there is no need for a new Cold War, so that this is very encouraging. But we all know that acute tensions on the Taiwan issue remain. I think President Xi used the term red line. I don't think that was that was a mistake. And President Biden warned China against coercive action on Taiwan. There have been many hints of maybe a change in U.S. policy toward so-called strategic clarity. I've been involved in a lot of Taiwan debates and discussions over the years, but never one like this. So I think this should be a really fascinating discussion. We have a great group of experts here. I'll just briefly introduce our panel, and really looking forward to some interesting discussion on the issue of semiconductors and the future of Taiwan. So let me just introduce the whole panel here, and then they'll each make a brief statement of introduction here. But we have John Bateman. He's senior fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His work focuses on large-scale policy challenges such as U.S.-China technology tensions, global influence operations, and systemic cyber risk. He's also author of a report, U.S.-China Technological Decoupling, a strategy and policy framework. We also have, we're fortunate to have Emily Weinstein, who is research fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, where she focuses on U.S. national competitiveness in AI, machine learning technology, and the U.S.-China technology competition. She's also a non-resident fellow in the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, and she does a lot of work with the National Bureau of Asian Research, too. And then we also have our own Chris McCallion. He's fellow at Defense Priorities. He recently wrote an explainer, which really is kind of has got this whole discussion started here, at least for us. This is an explainer for Defense Priorities entitled "Semiconductors Are Not a Reason to Defend Taiwan." And he holds a Master of Science from the London School of Economics. So we're so glad to have all of you. And maybe I'll ask you all to speak in that order. I might reverse the order sometimes in the discussion, but let's start with John, if you will, a brief statement of your thoughts on the issue.
Well, great. Well, thanks, Lyle, for including me in this conversation. And it's great to be with Emily and Chris. And I know we're going to have so much to talk about today and hear the audience Q&A as well. So let me just cut to the chase and give my view on the top line question. I don't think semiconductors are a reason to defend Taiwan, but they certainly are a reason to try to deter China from attacking Taiwan. And so then the question is, what's actually the best way to do that in a way that doesn't cause unnecessary damage to other important US priorities? And in my view, the latest export controls from the United States are the wrong answer. So let's start with looking at Taiwan's semiconductor industry from China's perspective. We all know how valuable chips are, and so access to and control over this resource has huge economic and military value. But semiconductors are nothing like past generations' critical dual-use resources, like oil or rubber, which Japan could simply take by force in World War II. The manufacture of these chips is extremely technologically sensitive. It has high human capital needs, and it requires a lot of international inputs. So any war over Taiwan is likely to either destroy this industry outright or render it inoperable for a long period of time, meaning that we can't really defend it in a traditional way. And if that were to happen, then that would throw China, the United States, and much of the rest of the world into a deep recession or possibly worse. And that then brings us back to the importance of deterrence. So what does all this have to do with the latest export controls? People may know that last month, the Biden administration put in powerful restrictions on China's ability to import the most advanced semiconductors and the equipment and know-how that China would want to use to build up its own chip industry. Now, the formal justification for these export controls is military. The argument is that these controls will inhibit China's military modernization. And it's sometimes argued that if we can slow China's military modernization in such a fashion, then we can reduce China's confidence in its ability to successfully take Taiwan by force and thus bolster deterrence. Now, let's set aside for a moment whether that's really how China will make this decision in the end, and think about the basic military logic here, which in my view has never really been spelled out in detail and actually seems kind of dubious. So firstly, what we're doing with these controls is we're really attacking China's ability to employ artificial intelligence in a military fashion. And yet, what actually is going to be the role of artificial intelligence in a future US, China, Taiwan war contingency? Remarkably, the Department of Defense has really never spelled this out in detail. So you're left trying to guess or imagine what an AI-driven war over the next few years might look like. And actually, if you look at most assessments of a possible war, most people argue that it really will come down to very tried and true factors, nothing exquisite like artificial intelligence. Things like, what is China's capacity to mount an amphibious landing? What is their jointness, their combat readiness? Where's Taiwan's air defenses? What's the political will and the level of training of the Taiwanese people and their reserves? Really, it's hard for me to imagine that artificial intelligence will be mission critical over the coming years. And to the extent it is, we have to consider that China might be able to fulfill a niche military capability like that through smuggling or workarounds. The other thing that the US administration has pointed to is that China is using these chips and supercomputers to improve its weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons. These are not likely to be particularly relevant in a Taiwan war either. So in my view, the military logic for these export controls really hasn't been spelled out, but there is military risk of these controls. And that comes into play when we remember that our major deterrent, or one of our major deterrents, vis-a-vis China is economic, not military. And in a weird way, these controls could potentially undercut that deterrent. If China cannot already access Taiwanese semiconductor fabrication capability, and that's the world that we're moving toward with these controls, then any damage to Taiwan's semiconductor industry that occurs during a war would actually fall asymmetrically on China's opponents, not China itself. And at the same time, if we tell China now that we're on a path to deny the country access to the benefits of high-tech economic integration with the world, then that makes it less helpful for us to try to deter China by threatening some kind of Russia-style economic isolation in the future if it were to invade Taiwan, because China may just conclude that we're already on that path anyway. And more broadly, it locks us into a zero-sum relationship and brings the specter of Cold War and containment, which, as we know, does increase the risk of war and miscalculation. So I hope that in the discussion, we can get into some of the broader issues at play about the US allied relationship, our own industry, and what it means to decouple in a bigger way, which has huge long-term consequence. But I'll just stop right there for now.
Okay, thanks, John. Very interesting. Emily, I think you take a different view.
Yeah, I was going to say I have a few different thoughts, I would say, than John, but obviously, like, very happy to get into the debate here later on in the Q&A. I would say that I am tentatively or cautiously optimistic about some of the new controls, and I'm referring to the ones that John was mentioning that came out in October 7th or on October 7th. Tentatively optimistic in that they seem to be, I would say they are broad, but they are tailored. But my concern is that with these new controls on high-end semiconductors and some of the semiconductor manufacturing equipment, what we need to do is actually pay more attention to them and kind of watch them going forward, which for those who have been kind of in the export control world for a long time, economic considerations were never part of the debate, really. It was more of, export controls built on this idea of preventing the proliferation of WMDs or conventional weapons. It was assumed that the national security implications here were so urgent, so extreme, that the economic considerations didn't even really matter at this point. It was, we had to decide this because it was necessary for national security. But But what we're seeing now is I would say a shift in terms of how we're thinking about using export controls. Where, and I think John alluded to a little bit more of, the actual. If you read the Federal Register announcement, if you read the new export controls, they do obviously talk about this supercomputers for the purposes of WMDs. They talk about, again, the military implications here, but I think the underlying assumption is also the broader economic considerations here, in terms of competing with China in artificial intelligence, and kind of the benefits that might come from whoever has first mover advantage in some of these emerging fields within AI. So we're seeing this shift again to having to think more about the economic considerations of export controls. And I want to highlight, I would say, just kind of two brief takeaways that a colleague and I, Tim Huang at CSET, wrote about in terms of lessons that we can learn in decoupling, or lessons that we can learn from deploying tools of decoupling, like export controls. And we studied this actually using a case study from the 1990s involving the US satellite industry when, and for those who are interested in diving into this more, there's plenty out there on this. I would also recommend reading the report that we wrote. But what we looked at was a unilateral move on the US government's part to move satellites, commercial satellites and their components, from being deemed as dual use exports to being deemed as munitions. And obviously in that shift there, exports of munitions are much under a much stricter regime than exports of dual use items. So what happened in this case, long story short, the US went from, in 1995, occupying about 75% of the global market share in commercial satellites, to 10 years later, and 5 years after that policy shift, to only occupying about 25% of the market in commercial satellites. So if we think about this in the context of some of the newer controls, I think it provides a really interesting case study in thinking about how we use these tools. And so the kind of two big lessons that Tim and I drew from the study were this idea that the success of decoupling tools, if we can call them that, like export controls, really depends on the characteristics of the technology being controlled. And I know with chips and with semiconductors, and obviously Taiwan being home to TSMC, which is such a kind of central node in the semiconductor supply chain, we really have to think about the geographic distribution of where the supply chain is, who are the companies involved, and who really occupies those key choke points or key choke point nodes in that supply chain. We also argue that different types of technologies may be more or less amenable to decoupling tactics like export controls. And in this paper, we talk specifically about artificial intelligence, and we broke it down into three categories, hardware being one of them, which is relevant in the discussion on semiconductors. But we also talk about data and algorithms. And what Tim and I kind of argued in this piece was that because of the proliferation of so many open source platforms, and for a whole host of other reasons, data and algorithms as a type of, or an aspect of artificial intelligence, are not as amenable to decoupling tactics like export controls. So not saying that there's any rumors that the US government is going to go down the rabbit hole of deciding to put export controls on AI software, AI algorithms. I haven't heard anything on that front, but it provides an interesting way to think about the new controls on hardware in particular. The last thing I will say, and I kind of saved my big answer to the question that this panel is trying to discuss here for the end. Are semiconductors a reason to defend Taiwan? No. I would say that there are plenty of other reasons, plenty of other stronger reasons to defend Taiwan, both in terms of helping to defend and stand up or support a strong, liberal, democratic nation in the Asia Pacific, among so many other reasons. Semiconductors should be a part of, I would say, the calculus in terms of how we do contingency planning around a potential Taiwan invasion scenario. But when it comes down to it, there are so many other reasons to want to defend Taiwan besides just the presence of TSMC. So I'll stop my comments there and look forward to the Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much, Emily. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Lyle. And thanks to Emily and John as well. I'm very honored to be included in a discussion with them. I'm, unlike John and Emily, I'm not a tech expert or an export control expert. So I'm going to more narrowly focus on what I wrote the paper on and the security side, because the task I was kind of given was to, assess the geostrategic importance of Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing industry, and to determine what, if any, commitments and military force the U.S. should be making in order to defend that or prevent disruptions of that industry. And just to kind of recap the arguments I make in the paper, which, as you can guess what the main takeaway is from the title. My view is that the so-called silicon shield, which is to say the view that Taiwan semiconductors either deter China from taking some kind of forceful action against Taiwan, or that they might provide some kind of positive incentive for China to try to invade and take over TSMC, take over Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing capacity. My view is that this silicon shield is neither strong as an incentive or a disincentive to Chinese use of force. And in particular, I look at this scenario that some people have talked about, where China might try to take over TSMC, presumably put its talent base to work at gunpoint or something, or maybe through more positive incentives, and run the place under new management. I'm not the first one to point out that there are some problems with this. The main problem being that China would then be cut off from a whole panoply of upstream inputs that are controlled largely by either the U.S. or allies of the U.S. There was a report by Boston Consulting Group that found 50 plus different potential choke points throughout the semiconductor supply chain. So this is a kind of example of weaponized interdependence where the U.S. has a strong hand. And so I'm very skeptical that China could ever pull something like that off. I would just say that the USCC report from 2021 came to a similar conclusion. The second kind of scenario I looked at, which people like Hal Brands have brought up before, is say China were to blockade Taiwan, or there were an attempted invasion that led to a more protracted conflict, or if, say, TSMC was damaged critically, and there was a kind of global disruption of semiconductor supplies, that this would lead to a very serious recession. There's all kinds of downstream effects that this would create, on all kinds of electronics manufacturers and so forth. The issue with this argument, or this, trying to find a way to deal with the scenario through force, is that a war with China will be immeasurably more costly than any kind of semiconductor supply disruption. Some people say that that's a very good reason why we should therefore have a very robust deterrent to prevent a war from breaking out in the first place. And I think the main issues here are that have to do with kind of views about deterrence in general. I think the main problem when we pose the question, should the US defend Taiwan, is can the US defend Taiwan? And the problem right now is that it's difficult to say with confidence that the US actually can defend Taiwan. And particularly, most people in the security establishment agree that a cost imposition approach is not going to be sufficient, that we need to have a deterrence by denial approach. I think that in a way decides the issue, trying to build up, trying to catch up essentially, and develop the capabilities to deter China may lead to a kind of may lead to a situation where China feels like it has a closing window that may actually speed up China's timeline and encourage them to take more drastic action than they would otherwise feel that they have to take. Anyway, I don't want to press up against my time too much, so I have much more to say, but I'll save it for the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's excellent. I'm also very concerned that this, in Beijing there may be see a ticking clock and think that they need to or ticking clock, excuse me, and think that they need to act in the near term. Well, let me open up to take a kind of, before we tackle the Taiwan scenario kind of narrowly as we should. Let's discuss this kind of broader views of decoupling, if that's okay. And maybe we'll start with John and then go to Emily again. But John, I see you have quite an interesting take on decoupling. That perhaps the end game is really hazy. Maybe you could elaborate a little more on your critique of decoupling, and then one other question, just from your opening remarks, John. Do you not think that maybe it's too late? I mean, I actually do think AI is. I'm more a military analyst, and I'm studying the scenario and what China brings to the fight. I actually see AI playing a major role in a possible invasion, and I actually think China probably already has what it needs, including on the AI front. So, in other words, like, this is maybe too little, too late.
No, Lyle, I would totally welcome you coming in with some of the use cases that you think could have a critical difference there in terms of China's current AI capabilities. I think that could be a really interesting discussion. So just on your question about broader decoupling, I think this is a great opportunity to engage with some of Emily's comments as well. Because Emily, I think I totally agree with, what I heard from you, which is that we've been going through a transition from a prior era where tools like export controls were targeted narrowly at national security issues to the current era where economic considerations are part of the picture in some form or other. And I think this gets to your point, Lyle, about decoupling. Decoupling is not necessarily any explicit strategy that anyone has, but it's the kind of emergent result of this change in thinking where China's rise in the world, its economic development, particularly in areas of high technology with dual use applications, but beyond that, and our integration with them are now more seen as vulnerabilities to the United States, to US national security and economic interests. And those two things are increasingly kind of jumbled and fused. National security now kind of includes economic security, and then economics is kind of understood as a national security issue. So there's this kind of Ouroboros-like quality of all of those things getting jumbled together. And what I appreciated about Emily's comments is kind of putting that out on the table, because the administration right now is very reluctant to admit this. Formally, it's adamant that the latest export controls are not an effort to damage China's economy, did not include any considerations about the US economy, and are simply this classic kind of tailored military export control. But I think actually what we're seeing now is the use of tools such as this, such as export controls, to impede our geopolitical and geoeconomic competitor at a kind of broad and fundamental level. So often that's cloaked in the language of national security, but whether that's intended to be as limited to that or not, the consequence of it is primarily economic, right? So from China's perspective, the way these export controls are experienced is primarily an economic problem, less so a military problem. And so I think there's lots of ways to kind of come out this, but just to kind of be brief so I don't go on too long, this is so diametrically opposed to the basic premises of the multilateral trading system that the US has been cultivating for the last 70 years. And so we need to really think carefully about what really is the end game. Are we imagining a world in which we don't have the WTO in the future, for example? And instead that's replaced with a series of regional trade blocs or some kind of friend or ally set of arrangements. Has anyone come up with what those might look like? What are other countries' willingness to come along with us in that journey? And what would be gained or lost along the way? How many supply chains are we really going to be rebuilt in other forms? What will this do to inflation, to rising economic costs around the world, to the fact that we are kind of going through a productivity sort of malaise worldwide for the last 10 years. This is not unrelated to the rise of populism. So there's just lots of considerations that I think people really have not worked out And kind of my challenge to those who have a more restrictionist mindset is to kind of paint the vision of the world that we're actually entering into, and tell us what will be gained or lost along the way, because we haven't seen that. And instead, we've seen a lot of kind of claims that nothing really that important is happening, and that this is kind of the use of a traditional national security toolkit. And I don't think that's the case.
Okay, yeah, Emily, maybe you can give kind of your broader vision on decoupling, but I also just want to, if I may, ask for a little more detail on the satellite study, which I think is fascinating. As I said to you earlier, I guess though my again, not having studied it like you, but in a way, it seems to me the satellite case shows, demonstrates that China, I mean, after all, China's space program, could be said to be the envy of the world at this point. Incredible achievements. And if I'm not mistaken, a good part of the commercial launch market. Isn't this a case study showing that export controls have a very poor record and may even encourage, as it were, China to develop its own, technological ecosystem, which is extremely complete?
Yeah, no, lots to say on that, but let me just quickly, I want to respond to a few things that John mentioned, and add a few other comments on just decoupling as a concept. I want to say, so first of all, I am not in favor of US-China decoupling. I think for a whole host of reasons, we stand to lose, China stands to lose, the rest of the world stands to lose. And that's just because these supply chains are so interconnected at this point. And that's kind of I would say that's the logistical side of why we shouldn't decouple. But there are a whole host of kind of more soft power reasons why we also shouldn't decouple. But I would also say that in choosing to unravel U.S.-China supply chains in certain cases, I think we often forget that we in the United States potentially lose leverage over China if we also try to separate too much. So I think, the worst thing that we could possibly do is separate ourselves so much from China that we have no ability to track what China is doing in certain cases. Both, I would say, obviously this is very relevant in a military context, but from an economic and tech perspective too, having US and Chinese researchers still collaborating in certain areas of science and technology helps us make sure that we're not getting behind and China's getting way ahead of us and we turn around and we have no idea that that's happening. There are also obviously the conversation around the betterment of science and technology as a whole for the rest of the world, I think is super relevant too. So that's kind of my broad argument on decoupling. I also want to emphasize too that decoupling is not a one-way street. The Chinese government has been pushing they haven't actually, necessarily used the term decoupling that often, but they've been pushing to indigenize their supply chains since as early as 2005, 2006. And I'm thinking of the medium to long-term plan for science and technology development that came out in 2006 that started to push the narrative on indigenizing supply chains. And obviously, over the past 2 decades, we've seen other kind of subsequent policies, including obviously Made in China 2025 is kind of one of the big ones. So I want to say that the U.S. can decide tomorrow that we get it, we don't want to decouple with China. China may still push in that direction, and I think in the context too of conversations around, will U.S. export controls maybe push China to further indigenize their supply chains? To be honest, I think they would do it regardless. I think, China is going to push for indigenous innovation in key tech sectors or sectors that they deem critical, regardless of what we do. So obviously understanding that in certain places, if we push them a little harder, they may try to accelerate the timeline a bit more. Yeah. So I think there's a cost benefit analysis that has to happen here where we say, okay, are we willing to turn off or to pull this lever, understanding that China might accelerate here? Do we feel comfortable with that? Do we even actually acknowledge that that's the case? I think we also have to go into these policies assuming that, we have to think about what these second and third order effects might be. Before I get into the satellite example too, I want to just also point out that a lot of the language there, and I think John alluded to this too, the language around the military implications that kind of were the impetus for these new controls. The reason, at least from my understanding, the reason that the US government has pushed that narrative and has framed these new export controls in that light is to make it easier for US allies to fit these within the scope of their own export controls. Because the goal, obviously, this started out as something that was unilateral. It is extraterritorial in various ways, both in terms of the foreign direct product rule, but also, or rules, I should say, as well as the US persons controls. But the export control systems of our allies are very much built around this traditional idea of weapons of mass destruction and conventional weapons. So if we do want to make it easier for the allies to eventually impose similar restrictions in the context of chips and AI, framing it in terms of that traditional military context, it makes it more digestible for them and makes it so that that transition from unilateral to hopefully multilateral could be a bit smoother. I know obviously that's not perfect, and we're like stuck working with what we have and what our allies have, which is not ideal. But I want to recognize that again, that there's likely a broader reason why we might be framing it in that way. So quickly on the satellite case study, my quick story here, and for those who want to dive more into it, feel free. You can go out and read the Cox report that was came out of the Cox Commission from Congress in 1999. That was kind of this big investigation into overall trends in tech transfer between China and the United States. But what we saw here was there was a case involving two U.S. companies, Loral and Hughes, that were working to have satellites launched in China. There were a few launch failures, and lo and behold, it came out that after some insurance investigations and some other things, there were rumors, or there were concerns that the Loral and Hughes engineers had allegedly transferred some very key technical knowledge to the Chinese scientists and engineers that had allowed China to make strides in its missile systems. So because of that, again, there was that shift, like I mentioned, from viewing satellites as dual use goods to deeming them as munitions. And kind of, so the broader lesson here, and I brought up this idea of the change in market share, and Lyle mentioned this idea of, okay, well, look, 20 years later, China is now a leading space power. So I think what this shows us is this idea of needing to have tempered expectations on export controls. I think there's a lot of conversations now about whether or not the export controls that the U.S. is using, with regards to chips or on specific companies like Huawei or SMIC, that the idea is to go out and just completely use these controls to destroy a company or destroy an industry. And I think it's presumptuous of us to believe that we can do that just with our controls alone. And I want to emphasize that I'm talking mostly in the context of unilateral controls. I do think that if we want to have a broader effect, with hindsight, if we wanted to have done better at slowing China down in the satellite and the space industry, going the multilateral route would have been the better way to go. It's written into our export control regulations now, and in the Export Control Reform Act here in the US, that multilateral controls are more effective in the long term, and unilateral controls, although they may be easier to get through, often lead to unintended consequences and ultimately don't usually lead to the desired goals. So I think in looking at this, so we see now, again, looking here at 2022, almost 2023, that China again is leading in space, and we can argue about whether or not with hindsight we think that we slowed China's progress at all with some of the controls that we imposed. And I would say export controls are just one of them. There's the Wolf Amendment that also prevented any type of collaboration between NASA engineers or contractors and Chinese scientists working in the space industry as well. But I think, again, the biggest takeaway from this here is this idea of tempering our expectations. We have to assume that the controls will work, especially if they're unilateral. They will work for a short amount of time, but we should try to make them multilateral wherever possible. And we can't go into these assuming that they're going to achieve 100% success. I would almost say go into this assuming 50% success rate, and then kind of try to build other policies to complement the export controls that can help to fill in that remaining 50%. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah. Okay. Great, Emily. Fascinating. Yeah, I'm very interested to hear the caveats, and I agree. Tempering expectations is very important. By the way, I think Russia's contribution to China's space program is probably quite substantial too, and that's, I don't think, that probably will continue and maybe accelerate here in the new Cold War we're living in. But Chris, any thoughts generally on decoupling? I guess we also want to turn directly to the Taiwan issue. So I know your paper is mostly really focused on that. So just to get into that more substantially, do you think, Chris, that China might attack? And I want to ask the other panelists too. Do you think China maybe would attack Taiwan in order to capture those fabrication facilities? And if they did, how might China behave? How would they seek to control that, as it were, that market share they've captured? And in generally, what are what are the implications then for Taiwan policy of your findings?
Well, first, just on decoupling, I think probably my views are going to be much less sharp than Emily's and John's, because I rely on Emily and John to make judgments on these kinds of topics. So, my own view is that I think a lot of restrainers probably fall, more generally into the category that John lays out in his report on decoupling that could be called cooperationists, right? Whether it's kind of progressives on the left or libertarians on the right. My own views probably lean a little bit more towards the centrist position that John lays out on this. Although, John, in his recent piece in Foreign Policy, says that the restrictionists have won. So kind of a sober assessment of where we're at. I'm not particularly surprised that there's a long-term technological economic competition going on between the US and China, right? What I'm kind of more worried about, and this is where we get into the question of if we're in a new Cold War or not, is the interaction between that competition and this broader military competition. And I think that it's the latter that seems to me less necessary and much more dangerous. I think, if you imagine, for instance, the announcement of these new export controls, but without the additional context of, say, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan or President Biden's statements implying that we're shifting towards a position of strategic clarity, it's not to say that they wouldn't be very dramatic and impactful, but I think that it would be a little bit less of a hothouse climate, right? And so I'm quite worried about the way that these levels of competition interact with one another. It's a very, valid point to say that all of these things are connected. But sometimes I think we might even err on the side of thinking that, everything is so interrelated and the knee bone is connected to the thigh bone and so forth, that especially in the military dimension can start drawing us into kind of domino theory type thinking, where everything is a kind of crucial zone of contestation. And, even the subject of the paper I wrote, are semiconductors a reason to defend Taiwan? Well, there may be other reasons to defend Taiwan, right? And it may be difficult to separate those out. I think sometimes, though, there's a tendency to kind of say, well, any one given reason that might be given to defend Taiwan may not be sufficient, right? It may not be ultimately worth World War III. But somehow kind of cumulatively, they kind of add up, like 4 not so great reasons add up to one really good reason why we should. And I think that it's, maybe it's a kind of academic exercise, but I think it's worth kind of trying to separate these things out and examine them on their merits and kind of intellectual isolation. I think it's valuable. As far as the question of TSMC, or, some people have speculated that maybe China would not feel compelled to try to invade Taiwan to take over TSMC before, but that this newest round of export controls do incentivize them to do so, or limit their options in a way where maybe it seemed crazy before, but they, are compelled to do so now. I may be missing something, but I don't find that to be very. I'm very skeptical of that, because I think that the same. If the export restrictions on China are so dramatic that it compels them to take such a reckless action, then I don't think that taking over TSMC solves the problem for them, right? They're going to face the same risk of, they're going to face the same restrictions that they face now through these export controls. So I don't see how that would help them. I think you asked some other stuff, Lyle, but I
think you talk in the paper about, like, even if, let's just say they did take over the facilities and whatnot, and successfully or something, what do they do with this so-called advantage that they've achieved or something?
Well, I don't think they could do much, because they would then be in a position where they would have to reconstruct all the upstream nodes of the supply chain. And that's not going to happen for a very long time. Mm-hmm. I think, Chris Miller made a statement to this effect recently too. So, I just don't see it as being, at least in the kind of, coming years, something that's very likely to happen.
Okay, very good. I'd like
to add a two-finger on that just quickly.
Yeah, I was going to come to you next, Emily. So let's hear what Emily and John have to say about this Taiwan scenario, how it might play out, how the chips might play out, and then I'll probably go to each of you for kind of a closing statement, since we're kind of short on time. Okay, Emily.
Sure. So to answer just the broader question of would China invade Taiwan purely for the purposes of getting hold of TSMC, to be honest, I don't think that's even part of the calculus for China. I think their ambitions behind wanting to invade Taiwan are much more cultural, historical, political. I don't think, I think getting access to TSMC maybe in the most hypothetical scenario would be cool to them, but I don't think it's part of the calculus. And I do want to say too that even if, God forbid, we were to have China go in and successfully take TSMC, there would still be, and I think Chris alluded to these too, there would still be so many roadblocks for them to be able to use that facility effectively. Chips are a really interesting case study in understanding, technology and tech transfer, because a lot of the technology involved with, a lot of the technology at TSMC and a lot of the technology in the supply chain involves or has involved decades and decades of research and engineering, and there's a level of intangible knowledge that goes into or intangible knowledge that is part of the engineers and scientists and folks who are working at TSMC. I would say this is also the case with ASML in the Netherlands and EUV photolithography. Where we even, and in the context of ASML, we have one of my colleagues at CSET found a great quote from a Chinese semiconductor company manager back in 2018 that said that even if ASML were to turn around and give us the blueprints to their EUV machines, we still would not be able to replicate them. And it's because of that lack of the intangible knowledge there. So again, China could walk in, take over TSMC, get rid of everyone and say, okay, this is ours now. And that would be, and most perfect scenario would be that nothing is damaged, which again, probably not the case. They would still then have to figure out what to do in terms of the workforce issue. This is not something that you could just drop Chinese engineers in and say, okay, now, run with it. And I think too, and I think it was Chris who mentioned this maybe in his opening statement too, there's a conversation maybe about, okay, maybe China could go in and try to coerce or incentivize some of the Taiwanese engineers at TSMC to work for them. I think that is the likeliest of all scenarios, and even that in itself is very unlikely. So that's kind of my 2 cents on that question.
So if you just to bring it to a head, I mean, if the missiles are flying and you're briefing President Biden on options on Taiwan, are you gonna bring up semiconductors, or or talk about, liberal democracies?
To be honest, semiconductors probably wouldn't be part of the question. I think it'd be more about the actual, tangible military, about combatants, non-combatants, all of that. I don't think semiconductors would be part of the conversation, at least in the first week or so.
Okay, interesting. John, what are your thoughts on the scenario, narrowly put?
I actually wanted to follow up on Chris's comment about the perceived interconnectedness of all of the China and China tech and national security issues, and the knee bone connected to the thigh bone. I think he hit on something really important there, which I often observe in the discourse around these issues, that much like the domino theory in the Cold War, people are so afraid of China for legitimate reasons. I mean, all the concerns that we have about China are very real, and I worry about them just as much as the next person. But people construct very loose, vague, and esoteric sets of causal chains to then justify actions that often don't make sense or are oversteps. So I'll just give you some examples of this. So China dominates the global drone market. And there is all sorts of fears about how China could somehow ingest the data that those commercial drones are creating and use those for nefarious purposes. Okay, fair enough. If I were the US military, I absolutely would not be flying DJI drones for anything other than like to test them or whatever. But under the Trump administration, the Department of Interior decided that it could no longer fly Chinese drones, to include cases like flying them over national forests to help fight firefighters. Now, no one has ever really given a rational explanation for this policy. Likewise, under the Trump administration, the Chinese consumer electronics company Xiaomi was placed on a do not invest list, meaning that US persons could not invest in Xiaomi. And the explanation was, well, they're doing something with AI and they're doing something with 5G. And we know those are important. So, we got to block that. And that was later struck down in court. I think the Biden administration has avoided some of these excesses. But I think to Chris's point about why I think the restrictionists have won, the restrictionists have won, I think, because they've convinced people that they're centrists. So Jake Sullivan has come out and taken on the mantle of small yard, high fence. He has said, and lots of people have repeated the idea that the latest US export controls on China's semiconductor sector are an example of this tailored, calculated small yard, high fence approach. And I think the way that logic works is by embracing such a high threat perception and such a sense of interconnectedness amongst all of these technologies, that then people become convinced that, well, if China could somehow get a semiconductor and it could somehow flow to the military, and then the military could somehow use that to improve its drone swarms, and then the drone swarms could somehow be important in the Taiwan Strait. And there's so many kind of logical steps in that are rarely spelled out in detail. And the biggest step, I think, that's often missing is, what are the costs of taking on such harsh restrictive measures? And so part of my public writings are helping people rediscover those costs and risks, which I think have been totally submerged in the public discourse. We're so threat and risk oriented vis-a-vis China. We're not thinking about the broader decoupling and anything that might be problematic there to our own industries, to the global trading system, to our allies, to US domestic politics, to our economy. And so if we can reconstruct a sense of what's at risk through an overzealous use of restrictive tools, then all of a sudden people can see how crucial it is to have a real sense of the problem that we're trying to solve and really hold it up to scrutiny.
Well, that's great, John. I would underline those points twice. But do you want to comment on the scenario? I mean, I guess you're not buying is what I'm taking, but also that you said deterrence is the way to go. Does semiconductors play in a kind of deterrence strategy somehow, or
I agree. I agree with Chris and Emily that I think ultimately President Xi or his successor in facing this decision. Look, this will be the biggest decision faced by any Chinese leader in decades. It will, on the one hand, create the possibility of national reunification and rejuvenation narrative that the Chinese leadership and the CCP has heavily invested in, and kind of, in essence, complete the Chinese Civil War, which is such a part of the national narrative and identity. On the other hand, it places at risk China's role in the world, its economic and diplomatic integration with many countries, its stature as a kind of legitimate world leader. And so I think China will decide based on how it balances those two things and what it thinks its military can accomplish. I think semiconductors are not going to enter into it.
And the way they might, if they captured the facilities, would they use that against, would that become some kind of threat to the U.S. economy or something like that?
Well, I do think that if I were China, I would certainly try to preserve that infrastructure, place it on a no strikes list, and come up with some plan to get those things working again. I'm skeptical that plan will work, but yeah, I don't know how much that will really impact the course of the war, right? Presumably, if China wants to not simply destroy Taiwan, I mean, China is not Russia and Taiwan is not Ukraine, right? Russia really wants to kind of just like wipe Ukraine off the map and kind of reduce its kind of like power and ability to play an anti-Russia role. But China doesn't want to do that. China actually wants to take hold of Taiwan and integrate it into the Chinese system. So I think there will probably be lots of items on the no strike list if I were China. Now, I don't know if their professionalism and targeting processes are mature enough to accomplish that. But I think that would just be another item on the no strike list and probably not a major factor in the course of the war.
All right. Well, very interesting views, and I think we've delved into the scenario a bit, but maybe I'll ask everyone to kind of give some closing comments and feel free to respond to each other's points. I guess let me start with Chris, and then we'll go to Emily and John. But if you guys can keep it to 2 minutes, it'd be great. I guess a couple of parting questions on my part would be, and address these if you want, but really you should address what you want. But the amount of sanctions that the U.S. has in place across the world, it seems to me that at some point this just becomes a tremendous drag on U.S. companies and U.S. growth potential. It also vastly complicates our relationships with allies, and I'm not even talking about partners, or countries that, like India that are kind of in that gray zone, or Indonesia, which are, important future markets, but have a very different view of China, not to mention Russia and whatnot. I mean, the Schultz visit to Beijing also implies this is not going to be an easy struggle if we try to unify our allies and partners on what to do about China. So anyway, you want to address the broader questions, or just your final thoughts as well? If you can keep it to a couple of minutes, and we'll try to end nearly on time. Chris?
Yeah, I think the big kind of prescriptive takeaway from the article I wrote was that what the U.S. really wants to do in order to reduce its dependence on Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing industry is to buy time to try to, whether it be onshore or ally shore. And I think that both Emily and John have stressed the importance of trying to pursue a multilateral approach and coordinate with allies. This should actually be an advantage that the U.S. has available to it that China does not, and should actually, we should be feeling optimistic about the prospects in that regard. In general, I think the kind of best version of these export controls are, as Emily was saying, they're not going to like permanently, forestall China from becoming an advanced technological power that may challenge the U.S., but they're going to buy some time. And I think that for the foreseeable future, at least, there's going to be a few conditions that are going to hold, which is that we won't be able to say that the local military balance really favors the U.S. There's going to take some time for the U.S. to build up its own domestic chip manufacturing capacity, or to develop ties with friends and partners who can do that, who can effectively compete with Taiwan. China's not going to be able to replace all these other nodes of the supply chain for the time being. And, there's a more variable question, which we can't answer definitively, which is the question of China's military modernization, right? Are they even really seriously contemplating using some kind of force against Taiwan before they complete that? And so I think that, all of us are basically in favor of trying to find ways to buy time. I think that the main danger on the export control side is that in trying in the short term to kind of isolate China, we may in the long term or medium term kind of more end up isolating ourselves. I think that that's the kind of danger on that front. Not that it's going to accelerate China trying to invade Taiwan or something. And I think, on the security side, what I really fear is that we end up acting to provoke exactly the kind of conflict that we want to avoid. And I think, in the US, we've adopted this view that deterrence is always the way to, every problem can be bottled up with deterrence. If you want peace, prepare for war. And we might actually be provoking a security dilemma spiral kind of dynamic in this situation.
Emily, what are your final thoughts?
I don't have too much else to add, but I want to double down on the point that Chris made about allies as our advantage here. I think that is something that, in the long history of well, I say long history, the past few years of US-China competition, both in the technology realm and outside of the technology realm, I think one of the things that has always come up is this idea that the US has friends and China has Pakistan, maybe. Like, I wouldn't even call Pakistan a friend really to China. It's more of a, same with Russia, a convenient ally, an ally of convenience, whatever you want to call it. So making sure that, obviously our interests are not going to be the same as Germany's always. They're not going to be the same as India or any of these other allies that we have, but trying to at least make sure that they understand our rationale for doing things, that they understand what our objectives are and why we're doing things. We can tell them, again, we understand why you might be concerned about what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. And we hope that we can eventually try to convince you to jump on board. But I do think that that's the best way forward, both in terms of export controls and just in the kind of broader context of the China relationship with the rest of the world.
A lot of work to do there. Great. Emily, thank you. John?
Yeah, sure. And just thanks, Lyle, Chris, Emily. This has been such a rich conversation. I've really enjoyed it. So Chris used this phrase, buying time, and that strongly resonates with me. I've written about that as well. I think at the end of the day, the strategic situation that the United States faces in the realm of technology is that China is catching up with us in a lot of different areas of both economic and military and national security importance. And so what we want to do is maintain our leads where we can. And most of what we can do is internal self-development. We only have some marginal control over China's path of technological development. We can choke some choke points, and we can hit them on a few things, and we can bring our allies along. But I think Emily and Chris have both made the observation that over time, China has the national endowments that it needs to become a leading technological power. And it's done that to great effect, even in areas where it really hasn't benefited much from intellectual property theft or things like, so the drone industry would be another example where they've created that industry to a great degree. So what then is the role for export controls and other restrictive measures? To a great degree, I think it's buying time for investments that we make in ourselves to bear fruit. So that if we feel that, as the Biden administration has said, that this is some kind of decisive decade, and if maybe that applies in the technology realm, maybe there's an area like 5G telecommunications equipment where it seems like there's a closing window of opportunity, and China is on the verge of actually dominating that space in a way that we couldn't then wrestle back in the future. If that's the case, that's a great use for an export control, to buy time for the Western countries to get their stuff together, to create a new technology paradigm, to create our own improved competitiveness. But that means that's a very selective application of these tools. Because the other thing, and I'll just close on this, is that we also want to maintain control of this process. And Lyle, you commented on how US companies and other companies around the world, they're going to be reacting to the signals that are being sent by this decoupling agenda, right? They're very clear-eyed about all of this. And my fear is that folks in Washington have become accustomed to controlling the pace and scope of decoupling. It happens on our terms, when and where we want it to. And at some point, that will stop being true. At some point, we push our allies too far, we push China too far, we push the private sector too far, we push our own domestic politics too far, that feedback loops come into play, and things could move faster, farther, more chaotically, and in a direction contrary to our own interests. So that's why I think we really need to be very measured in the use of these tools. I think we've lost sight of that, and I hope we can get back on track.
Great. Fascinating session, folks. I learned so much. I think Chris really laid it out, and I encourage people to look at that explainer. That a lot of these assumptions about this scenario really don't hold water, and it's probably not likely that China would attack for semiconductors or would use this or could use the semiconductors to its advantage, and that probably this should not be a rationale to defend Taiwan, although there might be others. But and I found Emily's point fascinating about the possibility that we might be losing leverage here as well. And I think John's point is very well taken, that he draws attention to the costs, which we should be mindful of, even if we want to go forward, maybe with this small yard, high fence concept. I will say, just in closing, my 20 years working for the Navy, I had the chance to walk around at maritime expos in China and look at American UUVs that were undersea vehicles that were being displayed, and scratch my head and said, my goodness, how did this get here? And what are we trying to market to China? On the other hand, Emily makes an excellent point about that if we are totally isolated and try to build these giant fences, we may have no idea what's going on the other side of the fence. And I heard that argument a lot when working for the Navy, about a reason to engage with the Chinese Navy was so we actually knew what they were up to. We lose that ability if we cut off all links with China, including in these industries. And I think if we retain some linkages, at least we have a ability to steer China in a positive direction. So I for one, have not lost some faith in engagement. But again, a fascinating session. These are terrific experts. I think we'll hopefully continue this important conversation. Thank everyone for the time, and come back to Defense Priorities to talk about the hardest questions in Asia policy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Lyle. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.